the United States has launched a geopolitical contest against China. And so as a result of that, the US and China are racing towards a collision. It's happening for structural reasons. It is not due to personalities. The world's number one power will always push down the world's number one emerging power. So if China was expansionist, Australia will be a Chinese colony. And I have met many Americans who say to me directly, openly, honestly, China is the enemy. Two trains coming down the same track and gaining momentum and heading towards a collision. What do? Do you say, carry on, have a collision? Or do you say, stop? Think twice. Do you really want this kind of direct collision? So right now, unfortunately, the United States has launched a geopolitical contest against China. And so as a result of that, the US and China are racing towards a collision like two trains. And my goal is to try and stop the worst case scenario of an all-out collision between these two trains. And the reason why this is happening, why is that this collision happening? And actually, this is what I try to analyze in my book. It's happening for structural reasons. It is not due to personalities. Everyone thought, hey, the US-China contest started because of Donald Trump. But you notice, in the first paragraph of my book, I say, the US-China contest was launched by Donald Trump, but it will outlast him. Doesn't matter who's the president. And sure enough, after Joe Biden became president of the United States of America, he couldn't change anything. The contest still continues. And even though Joe Biden said in his election campaign that Trump's tariffs are hurting the American people, hurting the American workers, Joe Biden cannot remove them. And why can't he remove them? Because the geopolitical contest is driven by structural forces. And that is actually the main reason why I wrote this book, to try and explain the structural forces that are driving this contest. And let me quickly just mention three. One is, of course, the fact that whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which is the United States, the world's number one power will always push down the world's number one emerging power. So when the United States tries to prevent China from succeeding, that's normal behavior. That's what all great powers do. But the second structural force, which is something that nobody talks about, which is that there is also a fear of the yellow peril in the Western imagination. Now, this is something that is politically incorrect to discuss in many Western circles, but it's a fact. It's been there in Western history. And at the end of the 19th century, the United States Congress passed something called the United States Racial Exclusion Act to keep out Chinese migrants. Now, that already confirms that there is this fear of yellow peril that exists in the American psyche as well as the Western psyche. And of course, there's also the third structural force that's also explaining this downturn in US-China relations, is that there's been a bipartisan consensus in the United States among both the Republicans and the Democrats that after the United States engaged China, after the United States opened up China economically, China would also open up politically and become a liberal democracy. And then the liberal democracy of China and the liberal democracy of the United States would live happily ever after. Now, as we know, that's a fairy tale. But that's what Americans believed in. And because they believe in it, they're very disappointed that China is not creating a political system that the Americans like. And so the net result of it is that this is another reason why the US-China geopolitical contest is gaining momentum. So there are structural reasons why this is happening, and it's not due to personalities. And therefore, that's what I hope my book will help to contribute, make a contribution towards, is an understanding of why this is happening, this US-China geopolitical contest. Henry, and you're right. I mean, as I have a whole chapter in my book devoted to the question, is China expansionist? And of course, I cite the example of Admiral Cheng He, who traveled all the way from China to Africa, and he could have conquered many territories, many countries, but he never did so. And so the whole idea that the West has that China is expansionist is not true. If China was expansionist, Australia would be a Chinese colony and not a British colony, because Australia is much closer to China than it is to Great Britain, from which it was colonized. But at the same time, you're also right. I'm glad you mentioned Martin Wolf. I'm glad you mentioned Joseph Nye, and you spoke about how they mentioned that we got to find a ways and means of managing this US-China geopolitical contest, and I agree with them. There is absolutely no reason, and that is the conclusion of my book. As you know, at the end, I say the paradox about the US-China geopolitical contest is that it's inevitable and avoidable, right? You can avoid it because at the end of the day, if the goal of the United States is to improve the well-being of its people, if the goal of China is to improve the well-being of its people, they should be working together rather than working against each other. And that's why I wrote my book. And so I agree with your arguments. But at the same time, you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that I've been in New York. Yeah. And I've been in the United States now for 8 days. And the mood in the United States is very anti-China. Very. And I have met many Americans who say to me directly, openly, honestly, China is the enemy. And I was quite shocked, because even though I have written a book about US-China relations, so I know the state of US-China relations. But even in the time since I've written my book, right, and since I researched my book, there has been a tremendous shift against China in the American body politic. And that's a very sad thing, by the way. And I actually believe that there is no reason why the United States should regard China as the enemy. Because China is not trying to conquer the United States of America. China is not sending naval vessels to go to California. China is not sending armies to the Mexican border, to the Canadian border, to invade the United States. It's not happening. And yet, so many people in the United States believe that China is the enemy. And so, so even though all the people that you have interviewed, the Joe Nyes, the Martin Wolves, and others, Tom Friedmans, who at the end of the day, I think I know them all, want to try and achieve a reasonable outcome. But at the end of the day, it's the politicians who have to make the decision. And you notice, as I said, that even though the Joe Biden himself said that Trump's tariffs and sanctions have hurt the American people, he cannot remove them. He cannot do anything about them. And even Catherine Tai, whom you mentioned, I was hoping that in her speech she would say, okay, we will lift some of the tariffs and sanctions because they haven't helped the American people. But she can't do it. You see? So the mood in the United States, Henry, today is so anti-China that I'm personally very frightened by it. Really frightened by it. I had no idea how much the mood against China has become so negative in the United States. And that's why we need to have this dialogue to prevent the worst case outcome happening between US and China.